I'm Holly, 24 female. I live in a small, one-bedroom apartment that smells perpetually of coffee and anxiety, located just far enough from the city center to be affordable, but close enough to make the commute a daily grind. As a junior financial analyst at a large firm, my life is a spreadsheet of numbers, budgets, and projections, a world of order and logic that I cling to like a life raft. It's a stark contrast to the emotional chaos that has defined my family life for as long as I can remember. I thought graduating from college and securing a good job would finally be my ticket to independence and, perhaps, a sliver of my parents' approval. I was wrong. It was the catalyst for a betrayal so deep it would force me to audit my entire life and foreclose on the family I thought I knew. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. In my family, there were two distinct roles, assigned at birth and enforced with unwavering consistency. Sophie was the masterpiece, and I was the framework that was supposed to support her. Sophie, my younger sister by 3 years, was the golden child. She was radiant, artistic, and effortlessly charming. Her laughter was the soundtrack of our home, her accomplishments the centerpiece of every family gathering. When she decided to study art history, my parents, Eleanor and Richard, saw it as a reflection of her sophisticated soul. They framed her charcoal sketches and hung them in the living room, replacing the generic store-bought art. Her B-plus papers were praised as strokes of genius from a mind too creative to be bothered with conventional grading. My parents were her patrons, her biggest fans, and her tireless promoters. I, on the other hand, was the ghost. I was practical, quiet, and good at math. My straight A's were met with a nod and an absent-minded, "That's nice, dear." When I chose to major in finance, my father clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Good, solid choice, Holly. You'll always have a job." There was no excitement, no pride in the intellectual rigor of my chosen field, just a quiet relief that I was setting myself up to be self-sufficient. I was the reliable one, the one who didn't need the spotlight, the one who was expected to understand. My achievements were not celebrated, they were simply expected, like the sun rising in the morning. I was the sturdy, boring foundation upon which the beautiful statue of Sophie could be safely displayed. This dynamic was never more apparent than during our respective college years. For Sophie, college was an experience. My parents paid for her to have a beautiful apartment just off campus, filled with antique furniture my mother sourced. They sent her care packages filled with gourmet snacks and art supplies. My father co-signed a lease for a brand new car for her so she wouldn't have to rely on public transportation. When she wanted to study abroad in Florence for a semester, they liquidated some stocks without a second thought, proclaiming it was essential for her artistic development. "You can't put a price on culture, Holly," my mother would say to me over the phone, the unspoken addendum being for Sophie. For me, college was a transaction. I attended a state university, not because I couldn't get into a better school, but because it was the most affordable option. I lived in a cramped dorm room for 2 years and then moved into a rundown house with 3 other roommates. I worked 2 part-time jobs, one at the campus library and another waiting tables, to cover my living expenses. My parents paid my tuition, a fact they reminded me of frequently, but everything else was on me. Books, food, rent, a bus pass, it was all funded by late nights and early mornings. I took out student loans to cover the gaps, assuming that once I graduated I could count on them for a little help, just enough to get on my feet. It was a reasonable assumption, I thought. After all, they were my parents. They had always spoken about the importance of family supporting one another. The problem was, in our family, support only ever flowed in one direction, toward Sophie. I just hadn't fully accepted it yet. My graduation was a quiet affair. My parents and Sophie drove up for the ceremony. They gave me a sensible watch and a gift card to a store that sells professional work attire. We had a polite, unremarkable lunch at a chain restaurant before they had to hit the road. "Big day for Richard tomorrow," my mother said, referring to a real estate showing. "And Sophie needs to get back to her finals." There was no party, no grand gesture, no lingering celebration of my 4 years of relentless hard work. It was a checkbox, dutifully ticked. 2 years later, it was Sophie's turn. The difference was staggering. A month before her graduation, my mother was already in a fren. Zai of party planning. An event planner was hired. A custom cake was designed to look like a stack of art history books. Engraved invitations were sent out to 100 people. The theme was a new masterpiece, and the guest of honor was, of course, Sophie. The graduation itself was treated like a royal coronation. My parents flew in relatives from out of state. They booked a block of rooms at a boutique hotel. I watched from the audience as Sophie, draped in honors cords, floated across the stage. When her name was called, my father's cheer was so loud it echoed through the auditorium. He had barely clapped for me. Afterward, at the lavish party, my parents presented her with their gift, a 6-week all-expenses-paid tour of Europe. London, Paris, Rome, Athens. She would see the very masterpieces she had spent 4 years studying. Sophie burst into tears of joy, and my parents beamed, soaking in the reflected glory of their perfect, adored daughter. It was the proudest I had ever seen them. I stood in the corner, holding a glass of lukewarm champagne, and felt myself disappear. The weeks following Sophie's graduation party were a special kind of torture. My social media feeds became a highlight reel of her European adventure. There was Sophie posing coquettishly in front of the Eiffel Tower, her artist's beret tilted just so. There she was, looking contemplative in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, a thoughtful caption about Botticelli underneath. A picture of her eating gelato near the Colosseum in Rome garnered over 300 likes, and a flood of comments from family friends telling my parents what a wonderful gift they'd given her. Each post was a glossy, colorful reminder of my own muted reality. While Sophie was sipping wine in a Tuscan vineyard, I was eating a sad desk salad under the fluorescent lights of my office, trying to figure out how I was going to make my next student loan payment. The grace period on my loans had ended 6 months prior, and the reality of my debt was setting in like a grim, relentless winter. The monthly payment was a crushing weight, consuming nearly a third of my take-home pay. I was living frugally, cutting every corner I could. I brown-bagged my lunch, canceled my gym membership, and said no to after-work drinks with colleagues. Despite my best efforts, I was barely treading water. The pressure was immense, a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that followed me everywhere. It was in this state of desperation that I decided to swallow my pride and do the one thing I had promised myself I never would. I asked my parents for help. I rehearsed the conversation in my head a dozen times, trying to find the right combination of words that would sound responsible and not entitled. I called them on a Tuesday evening, catching them just after dinner. I started by asking about Sophie's trip, listening to my mother gush for 10 minutes about the life-changing experience it was for her. Finally, I took a deep breath and steered the conversation towards my own life. "Things are going well at the firm," I began, trying to sound positive. "I'm learning a lot, it's just, things are a little tight right now. The student loan payments are a bit more than I was prepared for." There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line. Then my father cleared his throat. "Well, Holly," he said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when he was about to lecture me on fiscal responsibility. "That's just part of being an adult. We all have bills to pay. You have a good job, you just need to budget better." I tried to explain that I was budgeting, that I had cut out all non-essential spending, but he cut me off. "Your mother and I helped you by paying your tuition. We can't be expected to pay for your loans as well. We've done our part." My mother chimed in, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "We'd love to help, sweetie, we really would. But things are just so tight for us right now. The economy, you know. Richard's commissions have been down, and Sophie's trip, well, that was a big expense. We had to dip into our savings for that. Our hands are tied." Dipped into their savings. For a 6-week luxury tour of Europe. But for me, to help me with the educational debt I incurred while working 2 jobs, their hands were tied. The hypocrisy was so blatant, so staggering, that I couldn't even form a response. I just mumbled, "Okay, I understand," my voice hollow. "We knew you'd understand, Holly," my mother said, relieved. "You've always been the sensible one. The sensible one. The one who could be relied upon to absorb disappointment without complaint. The call ended soon after, with cheerful goodbyes that felt like a slap in the face. I hung up the phone, my hand trembling. The injustice of it all burned in my chest, a hot, acrid anger mixed with a deep, familiar ache of worthlessness. They didn't have money for me, but they had money for her. It wasn't a matter of CES, it was a matter of priorities, and I had never been one. The next few days were a blur of bitterness. Every time a new postcard from Sophie arrived, a cheerful, breezy note from Barcelona or a stunning photo from the Greek Isles, it felt like a personal insult. My mother would call me, excited, to read them aloud over the phone, completely oblivious to my silent fury. Meanwhile, the voicemails from my loan servicer became more frequent. "This is an attempt to collect a debt," a cold, automated voice would say, a stark counterpoint to my mother's cheerful anecdotes. I started having trouble sleeping. I'd lie awake at night, my mind racing, replaying that phone call over and over. "Our hands are tied." The phrase echoed in my head, mocking me. They had tied their own hands with ribbons of favoritism and then pretended to be helpless. They had made their choice, and I was living with the consequences. The weight of their neglect was becoming unbearable, and a dangerous, desperate thought began to take root in my mind. There had to be something I was missing. There had to be another way. The breaking point came on a Saturday afternoon about a month after my phone call with my parents. I was at my childhood home, summoned under the pretense of helping my mother clear out some old things from the attic before Sophie returned. In reality, it was an excuse for my mother to show me the portfolio of professional photographs she'd had taken of Sophie in Paris. "Doesn't she just look like a model?" Elinor cooed, flipping through the glossy pages. I just nodded, my stomach churning. As I was hauling a box of old winter clothes down the rickety attic stairs, a smaller, heavy metal lockbox that had been hidden beneath them tumbled out and clattered onto the landing. It was a simple, gray fireproof box, the kind you buy at an office supply store. "Oh, careful with that," my mother called from downstairs. "That's just some of our old important papers." My father, hearing the noise, came into the hallway. "Everything all right up there?" he asked. I told them I was fine, but my heart was pounding. I had seen that box before, years ago, but had forgotten all about it. My parents were notoriously disorganized with their paperwork, stuffing important documents into random drawers. The fact that they kept this specific box in the attic, hidden away, struck me as odd. A flicker of something, a memory, an instinct ignited in my mind. Later that afternoon, while my parents were out in the garden, I found myself drawn back to the hallway where the lockbox now sat on a shelf. I don't know what possessed me, but I picked it up and took it to my old bedroom. The key, I remembered, was always kept in the back of my father's desk drawer, hidden under a tray of paper clips. It was a place he thought was clever, but I'd found it as a child snooping for candy. My hands were shaking as I retrieved the small, silver key. It felt illicit, wrong, but the feeling was quickly overpowered by a desperate need for answers. I had to know what was in that box. I unlocked it, the click echoing loudly in the quiet house. Inside was a collection of files and documents, their mortgage papers, car titles, my and Sophie's birth certificates. Standard stuff. But then, at the bottom, I found a thick blue folder with a label that made my breath catch in my throat. It read, Holly UTMA Trust. UTMA, the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act. I stared at the words, my mind reeling. A trust? For me? Vague, foggy memories from my childhood started to surface. I remembered my Uncle Marcus, my mother's older brother, talking to me after my grandmother passed away when I was 10. He had knelt down and told me that Grandma had left me something special, and that he was going to make sure it was taken care of for me until I was a grown-up, for my education. I hadn't understood it at the time, and over the years, the memory had faded into the background noise of my life. My parents had never, ever mentioned it. With trembling fingers, I opened the folder. The first document was a formal letter from my uncle's estate planning firm, dated 14 years ago. It detailed the establishment of a custodial trust account for my benefit, funded with an initial inheritance of $100,000 from my late grandmother. $100,000. The number seemed impossible, astronomical. The money was to be managed by a custodian, my father, Richard, until I reached the age of 25, at which point I would gain full control. The letter explicitly stated the funds were to be used for my education and general welfare. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. All those years I had scraped and saved, all those nights I had lost sleep worrying about money, all the debt I had accumulated, and this entire time there had been a safety net. A massive one. My initial shock quickly curdled into confusion, which then hardened into a cold, terrifying suspicion. I dug deeper into the folder. Behind. The initial letter were years of bank statements for the trust account. I spread them out on my childhood bed, my analyst brain taking over, my hands suddenly steady. I started with the most recent statement. The balance was $1,743.22. I felt the air leave my lungs. It couldn't be right. I flipped back, statement by statement, going backwards in time. The pattern was horrifyingly clear. For the first few years, the account had grown steadily with interest. But then, around the time Sophie started high school at a private academy, the withdrawals began. They were small at first, a few $1,000s here and there, labeled miscellaneous expenses. Then they got bigger. A $15,000 withdrawal coincided with the time my parents bought Sophie her first car. Another $20,000 withdrawal lined up perfectly with her semester in Florence. The largest and most recent withdrawal, a staggering $30,000, was dated just 2 months ago, right before Sophie's graduation. It was for her graduation trip. They had paid for Sophie's European tour with my money, my inheritance, my educational trust, the money my grandmother had left for me. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity, their claims of being financially tight, their refusal to help me with my loans. It wasn't that they couldn't afford it. It was that they had spent my own money on my sister and left nothing for me. They had told me their hands were tied, but they were the ones who had emptied my account, stolen my future, and handed it to my sister on a silver platter. The lie was so profound, so monstrous, that I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The grief and hurt were still there, but they were now overshadowed by a cold, sharp, and utterly pure rage. They had mistaken my quiet nature for weakness. They had mistaken my self-sufficiency for a lack of need. They had made a catastrophic miscalculation. And I, the quiet financial analyst, the sensible daughter, the ghost in their family portrait, was about to conduct the most important audit of my life. The drive back to my apartment was a blur. I had carefully photographed every single document in the blue folder with my phone before placing everything back exactly as I'd found it, locking the box, and returning the key to its hiding place. My parents were still chatting in the garden when I left, calling out a cheerful "Bye, sweetie." That sounded grotesque to my ears. They had no idea that their carefully constructed world of lies had just been shattered. Back in the sterile quiet of my apartment, I uploaded the photos to my secure laptop and began to work. The anger that had been a hot flame was now a cold, controlled fire, fueling a meticulous and methodical investigation. My grief was a liability, my analytical skills were my weapon. I created a new spreadsheet, the irony not lost on me. I titled it Project Reclamation. The columns were date, withdrawal amount, stated purpose, if any, and a final, damning column I labeled Corresponding Sophie Expense. For the next 3 days, I lived a double life. By day, I was Holly, the junior analyst, creating financial models and projections for my firm. By night, I was Holly, the forensic auditor of my own life, cross-referencing bank statements with my family's history. I scoured my mother's old social media posts, my own memory, and even old credit card statements of mine from college, where I had sometimes paid for family dinners. Each piece of data was a breadcrumb on a trail of profound betrayal. The $8,000 that vanished in the fall of 2017, that was the year Sophie decided she wanted to be a competitive equestrian, a hobby that required custom saddles and expensive lessons. A series of withdrawals totaling $12,000 throughout 2019 matched up perfectly with the tuition for her private arts high school. The $15,000 lump sum from March 2021 was for her first car, a brand new convertible that my father had claimed he got a killer deal on through a client. The $20,000 for her Florence trip, the $30,000 for her European tour, it was all there, a clear and undeniable pattern of theft. They weren't just borrowing. They were systematically draining my inheritance to fund a lifestyle for Sophie that they clearly couldn't afford on their own. They were using my future to pay for her present. The most painful part of the investigation was realizing how long and how deliberately they had hidden it from me. They had used my trust as their personal slush fund for over a decade. They had looked me in the eye and lectured me about budgeting while actively stealing from me. They had praised me for being responsible and independent because my self-sufficiency made their crime easier to conceal. My independence wasn't a virtue to them, it was a convenience. It meant I wasn't asking for money, wasn't looking too closely, wasn't questioning the blatant disparity in their treatment of their two daughters. They had counted on me to be the quiet, uncalm, plaining ghost, and for years I had played the part perfectly. Once I had the spreadsheet built, a horrifyingly detailed ledger of their deceit totaling over $98,000 in unauthorized withdrawals, I knew I needed professional help. My next step was to call the one person I knew I could trust implicitly, my Uncle Marcus. He was my mother's brother, but he was nothing like her. He was a man of integrity and principle, an estate planner who lived by the letter of the law. He was also the one who had set up the trust. When I called him and asked if we could meet, saying it was a sensitive financial matter, he agreed immediately, his voice warm and concerned. We met at his quiet, wood-paneled office the following Saturday. I had brought my laptop and a printed copy of the spreadsheet. I was nervous, my hands trembling as I set everything up on his large mahogany desk. "Holly, you look like you've seen a ghost," he said gently, closing the door behind us. "Talk to me. What's going on?" I took a deep breath and started from the beginning, the call about my student loans, Sophie's trip, the lockbox, and finally, the trust. As I spoke, his expression shifted from concern to disbelief, and then to a grim, cold anger that mirrored my own. I showed him the photos of the statements. I walked him through my spreadsheet, my voice clinical and detached, pointing out the correlations between the withdrawals and Sophie's major life expenses. When I finished, Marcus was silent for a full minute, his hands steepled in front of him. He looked older than his 60 years, the weight of his sister's actions settling on his shoulders. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and firm. "What they have done," he said, "is not just morally reprehensible, Holly. It is illegal. Your father, as the custodian of the account, had a fiduciary duty to manage those funds for your benefit and your benefit alone. Using that money for your sister's expenses, or for any purpose not directly related to your welfare, is a clear breach of that duty. It is, in legal terms, embezzlement." The word hung in the air between us, embezzlement. Hearing it from him, a legal professional validated everything I was feeling. This wasn't a simple family squabble over money, it was a crime. "What are my options, Uncle Marcus?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He leaned forward, his eyes meeting mine. "You have several," he said. "You can pursue this criminally, which would likely involve the district attorney's office and could lead to jail time for your father. Or you can handle this as a civil matter. You can sue him for the return of the misappropriated funds, plus interest and potentially damages. The evidence you've gathered is overwhelming. In a courtroom, they wouldn't stand a chance." He paused, then added, "There is a third option. We can confront them directly, present them with the evidence, and demand full restitution as a condition of you not pursuing legal action. It's less public, but it requires you to face them." I considered his words. The thought of sending my own father to prison was sickening, but the thought of letting them get away with it was unbearable. There was only one path forward that felt right. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about justice. It was about taking back the power they had held over me for my entire life. The third option was the only one that felt right. A public lawsuit or a criminal charge would create a spectacle, and while a part of me fantasized about that level of public shaming, a larger part knew it would only entangle me further in their drama. My goal wasn't just to get my money back. It was to sever ties cleanly, to perform a surgical extraction of myself from this toxic family unit. Confronting them directly on my own terms, armed with undeniable proof, That was the path to true freedom. It was my audit, and I would be the one to present the findings. Uncle Marcus agreed, offering his full support and legal counsel. He would draft the necessary legal documents, but he insisted that I should be the one to lead the confrontation. "This is your moment, Holly," he said. "You need to be the one they answer to." Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus and I worked together to prepare. It felt like getting ready for the biggest presentation of my career. He drew up a legally binding settlement agreement. It was a masterpiece of cold, hard legalese. The terms were simple and non-negotiable. My parents would have to repay the full amount of the misappropriated funds, which, after calculating a conservative rate of interest over the years, came to a grand total of $127,450. The agreement stipulated that they would have to liquidate any and all necessary assets to pay the sum in full within 90 days. If they failed to comply or missed the deadline, the agreement would become void, and I would be free to immediately file both civil and criminal charges. There was no room for negotiation, no chance for excuses. While Marcus handled the legal paperwork, I prepared my own presentation. I refined my spreadsheet, adding charts and graphs that visually represented the flow of money out of my trust and into Sophie's life. I created a timeline, matching dates of withdrawals with photos from my mother's social media: Sophie on her horse, Sophie in her new car, Sophie waving from a gondola in Venice. It was a damning, irrefutable narrative of their choices. I also prepared a personal impact statement, a short speech I would deliver before presenting the evidence. I wrote and rewrote it dozens of times, stripping it of any pleading or overly emotional language. I wanted it to be calm, factual, and devastating. I wasn't coming to them as a wounded daughter seeking an apology. I was coming as a creditor, a claimant, an auditor presenting the results of a forensic investigation into their character. The final piece of the plan was the setting. I couldn't do it at their house. That was their territory, where they held all the power. I couldn't do it at my tiny apartment. It needed to be neutral ground. Marcus offered his office, a place of law and order, but I decided against it. I didn't want him in the room for the initial confrontation. This had to be between me and them. I needed to see their faces without the intimidating presence of a lawyer. So I booked a small, private meeting room at a downtown hotel for a Sunday afternoon. I then sent my parents and Sophie a single, concise email. The subject line read, "Urgent family meeting." The body of the email simply said, "There is a serious financial matter we need to discuss in person. Please meet me at the Parkview Hotel, Conference Room B, this Sunday at 2 p.m. It is imperative that all 3 of you are there." The cryptic, formal tone was deliberate. It was meant to unsettle them, to put them on the back foot before they even walked through the door. The day of the meeting, I felt a strange sense of calm. The anxiety and anger had been transmuted into pure, focused resolve. I dressed professionally, in a sharp blazer and trousers, my corporate armor. I arrived at the hotel an hour early to set up. I arranged 4 chairs around a simple table. I had my laptop ready, a projector aimed at a blank wall, and a single file folder on the table in front of my chair. It contained 2 copies of the settlement agreement Marcus had drafted. When my family arrived, they were a flurry of confusion and irritation. "Holly, what is this all about?" my mother began, looking around the sterile conference room with distaste. "This is so dramatic." "Please have a seat," I said, my voice even and calm. I didn't stand to greet them. I just gestured to the chairs opposite me. Sophie looked bored, scrolling on her phone. My father looked annoyed, like I was wasting his valuable Sunday. They sat down, a tangible air of impatience radiating from them. "Thank you for coming," I began, my eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "I asked you here today because I have discovered a series of significant financial discrepancies that require your immediate attention. As you know, 2 months ago I asked for some help with my student loans. You told me that your hands were tied, that you were financially strapped, especially after paying for Sophie's graduation trip." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. That statement, I have since discovered, was a lie. A very calculated, very cruel lie. Before they could interrupt, I turned on the projector. The first slide appeared on the wall. It was the cover page of the UTMA Trust with my name in bold letters. My mother gasped. My father's face went pale. Sophie finally looked up from her phone, a confused frown on her face. The audit had begun. My father was the first to speak, his voice a choked whisper. "Where did you get that?" he asked, pointing a trembling finger at the projection on the wall. That's private." "I found it," I replied coldly, my eyes locked on his. "And as the sole beneficiary, I'd say it's more my private business than yours. You were merely the custodian, a role, it turns out, you were criminally unqualified for." I clicked to the next slide. It was the initial statement showing the $100,000 deposit from my grandmother's estate. Sophie's eyes widened. "What is that?" she asked, looking from me to our parents. "What trust?" "It's an educational trust our grandmother left for me," I explained, never taking my eyes off my parents. "Money that was legally designated for my education and well-being. Money our parents told me nothing about." My mother, Eleanor, started to recover from her initial shock, her expression hardening into one of indignation. "Now, Holly, there's no need for this kind of hostility," she said, her voice taking on a placating tone. "It was a complicated situation. We were managing it for you, investing it." "Investing it?" I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed in the small room. "Let's take a look at your investment strategy." I clicked through the next slides slowly, methodically. Each one displayed a major withdrawal from my trust. Next to it, I projected the corresponding photo or evidence of Sophie's expense. The $12,000 for her private high school, the photo of her in her school uniform. Click. The $15,000 for her convertible. The photo of her beaming from the driver's seat, which Mom had proudly captioned, "Sweet 16 came a little late, but it was worth the wait." Click. The $20,000 for her semester in Florence. A picture of her eating pasta with a view of the Duomo. Click. And finally, the most recent, most galling withdrawal, the $30,000 for her European tour. I put up a montage of her Instagram posts: Paris, Rome, Barcelona. With each click, the color drained further from my parents' faces. Richard stared at the table, unable to look at me. Eleanor's jaw was tight, her defensive posture crumbling under the mountain of evidence. Sophie just looked back and forth between the screen and our parents, her expression a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. She had been the unwitting, pampered recipient of stolen goods. "You used my inheritance," I said, my voice low and steady, "as your personal bank account to give my sister the life you couldn't afford to give her on your own. You didn't invest my money, you embezzled it." "Embezzled is a very strong word," my father mumbled, finally looking up. His eyes were pleading. "We were always going to pay it back, Holly. We got in over our heads. We wanted Sophie to have the best." "The best of what?" I shot back, my voice rising for the first time. "The best of everything while I got the leftovers. You lectured me on fiscal responsibility while you were stealing from your own daughter. You called me sensible and independent because it made your theft easier. Do you have any idea what the last 6 years of my life have been like? Working 2 jobs, living in terrible apartments, constantly stressed about money, taking on thousands in debt. All while you were spending my future on horseback riding lessons and trips to Italy." The dam of my composure finally broke, and tears of rage streamed down my face. "You didn't just steal my money. You stole my peace of mind. You stole my 20s. You stole my relationship with my grandmother by desecrating her final gift to me." I took a shaky breath, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. I looked at Sophie, who was now crying silently. "And you," I said, my voice softening slightly. "I don't blame you for any of this. You were just as much a victim of their lies as I was. They raised you to believe you were entitled to all of it, and they raised me to believe I was entitled to none of it. They pitted us against each other without us even knowing it." My parents opened their mouths to protest, to offer more excuses, but I held up a hand, silencing them. My moment of emotion was over. It was time for business. "Apologies and excuses are worthless to me now," I said, my voice returning to its calm, clinical tone. "The time for talking is over. Now, we're going to talk about restitution." I reached into the folder in front of me and slid the 2 copies of the settlement agreement across the table. This is a legally binding document drafted by Uncle Marcus. It outlines, in no uncertain terms, what happens next. I gave them a moment to look at the first page to see the terrifyingly large number, $127,450. You will repay every single dollar you took from me, plus interest. You have 90 days to liquidate whatever assets are necessary to come up with the full amount. That could mean selling your house. It could mean selling your cars. It could mean selling every piece of overpriced furniture my mother has ever bought. I don't care how you do it. But you will do it. I leaned forward. If you sign this agreement and adhere to its terms, this matter will remain private. I will walk away and you will never hear from me again. However, if you refuse to sign, or if you miss the deadline by a single day, I will walk out of this room and go straight to the district attorney's office with this entire file. Uncle Marcus has already prepared the criminal complaint for embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty. He seems to think you'd be facing significant jail time, Dad. My father flinched as if I'd struck him. The choice is yours, I concluded, sitting back in my chair. Sign the papers and lose your comfortable lifestyle, or refuse and lose your freedom. You have 5 minutes to decide. The 5 minutes I gave them were the longest of my life. The silence in the room was thick with the weight of their shattered reality. My father read the document, his hands shaking so violently the papers rattled. My mother stared at the number on the page, her face a mask of disbelief, as if she couldn't comprehend that there were actual consequences for her actions. Sophie, to her credit, was the first to act. She pushed her chair back, stood up, and walked over to my side of the table. "They have to sign it," she said, her voice thick with tears but firm. "They have to. What they did was wrong, Holly. I'm so sorry. I never knew." She looked at our parents with an expression I'd never seen her wear before, one of profound disappointment. "Sign it," she said to them. "Just sign it." Her words seemed to break the spell. My father, looking defeated and a decade older, picked up the pen with a resigned sigh and signed both copies. My mother followed suit, her signature a spidery, angry scrawl. I took one copy, pushed the other back towards them, and stood up. "The 90-day clock starts now," I said. "You'll be hearing from my uncle's office regarding the wire transfer details." I didn't say goodbye. I didn't offer a hug or a final word of condemnation. I just turned, walked out of the conference room, and didn't look back. As I stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, I felt a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying lift from my shoulders. It was over. The next 3 months were a strange, detached epilogue to my old life. I blocked my parents' numbers. I didn't respond to their tearful, pleading emails. I had one brief, difficult conversation with Sophie. She called me, crying, telling me they were selling the house we grew up in. She told me how furious our mother was, not with herself, but with me, for destroying the family. She said our father barely spoke. I listened, and I told her again that I didn't blame her, and that I hoped she would be okay. I meant it. But I also knew I needed to keep my distance, at least for a while. I needed to heal without the constant presence of my family's dysfunction. True to their word, on the 89th day, a wire transfer for the full amount of $127,450 appeared in a new bank account Uncle Marcus had helped me set up. Seeing that number, whole and clean and mine, was an indescribable feeling. It wasn't a jackpot or a windfall. It was a reclamation. It was the physical manifestation of my own worth, something my parents had tried so hard to deny me. The first thing I did was pay off my entire student loan balance in one lump sum. The confirmation email that read, "Your loan balance is $0," made me cry, but this time, the tears were of relief, not rage. With the remaining money, I didn't go on a lavish vacation or buy a fancy car. That would have been my parents' way. Instead, I made sensible, boring, Holly-approved decisions. I invested a significant portion in a diversified portfolio, creating a secure foundation for my future. I used the rest as a down payment on a small but sunny condo in a nicer, safer neighborhood, much closer to my work. The day I moved in, surrounded by my own boxes and my own furniture that I had paid for, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in my entire adult life. It was mine. The quiet, the stability, the future, it was all mine. It's been a year now. I haven't seen my parents. I heard through the grapevine that they downsized to a small rental apartment an hour away. Richard is still working, but Alina's part-time design business apparently dried up without her large home to use as a showroom. Sophie and I have started to tentatively rebuild our relationship. She moved into a small apartment with roommates and got a job at a local art gallery. For the first time, she's paying her own bills, living within her own means. She calls me sometimes for advice on budgeting, and in those moments, I feel a flicker of what it must be like to have a real sister. The healing is slow, but it's happening. As for me, I'm thriving. I was promoted at my firm. I'm dating someone who values my intelligence and my quiet strength. My life isn't loud or flashy, but it's stable and it's happy. Sometimes, I think about the anger and the betrayal, and it feels like a story about someone else. The ghost has a name. The ghost has a voice. And the ghost, it turns out, is a pretty good financial analyst. I audited my family's toxic books, closed them out for good, and used the returns to build a life of my own design, a future built not on their terms, but on mine. And the balance sheet, for the first time ever, is perfectly in the black.